Hello guys and welcome, it's Frostley here and we're going to be ranking all the heavyweight and light heavyweight UFC champions in order of ability. The superfight champions are included, but interim champions are not. In future videos I will be going through the other weight divisions. This is my opinion. I'm sure some of you won't agree with the placements and that is fine. Let me know in the comment section and I'll be happy to discuss. Before I start, if you could like and subscribe if you enjoy the video, that would be brilliant as it really helps me out. So let's get into it. As you can see, there are ranks, worst of the best, good but not exceptional, excellent, nearly the greatest and GOAT contender. I'm going to be starting with the lowest ranking fighters and then working my way up. They'll all be judged on their ability as fighters relative to their era. Firstly, we have Reece Smith. Most famous for his huge upset win over Mark Coleman for the heavyweight belt. He came into MMA as a world-class kickboxer with a very raw ground game. With the help of Ken Shamrock, he improved this area of his game and became more well-rounded. Despite this, he still lacked consistency and never really felt like a truly convincing heavyweight champion. There is certainly a number of heavyweights that fought during the same era as Smith that had a better all-round game and longevity at the top of the fight game than Smith ever did. Many of these are higher up on this list. Next we have Kevin Randleman, one of many wrestlers who experienced success in the early years of MMA and was good friends with another person on this list, Mark Coleman. Just like his friend, Randleman was excellent at ground and pound. Arguably his most famous moment was when he fought Basrutin for the heavyweight belt and controversially lost by split decision. What stops Randleman getting any higher on this list for me is the fact that he was fighting an era of great heavyweights and light heavyweights. Randleman just isn't near the top of that tall and hard to reach pile. Anytime he did fight the very best, he lost, and often, particularly later in his career, in convincing fashion. I know he did have that fight with Basrutin, as I mentioned, where it was a close fight, but Basrutin was kind of coming near the end of his career at that point and was struggling with injuries, so I don't think we can look into that one too much. Next is Rico Rodriguez, who came into the UFC scene about 2 years after Randleman debuted. Originally from a jiu-jitsu background, he had great takedowns which helped him develop a good ground and pound game with excellent submissions to utilise when necessary. All his UFC victories were stoppages, the last of which was a TKO victory over Randy Couture for the heavyweight championship. He never successfully defended the belt and left the UFC a year after, where he fought the rest of his career on independent promotions. It is a shame Rodriguez never got a chance to redeem himself after his losses in the UFC, as he may well be high on this list if he did. Instead, he is stuck with a group of decent heavyweights who never consistently cut it with the very best. The fourth person in the worst of the best category is Andrei Arlovski. He made his first appearance in the UFC at UFC 28 and amazingly is still fighting in the organisation to this date, although he did have spells at other promotions in between. He has noteworthy wins against the likes of Fabricio Werdum, Frank Mir and Tim Sylvia, the latter of which he beat to win heavyweight gold. He defended the title twice and had an impressive resurgence in the UFC at the start of his second stint. Despite this, he has always lacked consistency in his career, and it seems every time he builds up significant momentum, he loses, and this often triggers a losing streak. His longevity is certainly impressive, and it deserves to be commended, but he's not the best of the best, which is why he's low down on this list. Last in this tier is Tim Sylvia. He's a two-time heavyweight champion and a prolific knockout artist. The trilogy of fights he had with Andrei Arlovski were the highlight of his career. There's certainly no doubting Sylvia's toughness. Even after Frank Mir broke his arm with an armbar, he was still adamant that he wanted to continue to fight. Luckily, Herb Dean did step in and stop him continuing. There is a lot to suggest Sylvia should be ranked higher in this list, but what holds him back for me was his lack of wins against any of the great. He was a UFC champion at a time when most of the top heavyweights were fighting elsewhere, and once he eventually did fight the likes of Minotauro, Fedor and Couture, he lost all of them. So that is it for the best of the worst. We're now stepping up to good, not exceptional. In this tier, we're starting to see a bit more longevity at the top and a general step up in skill level. First up is Josh Barnett. He beat Randy Couture for the heavyweight belt at UFC 36 and would probably have been a dominant champion had it not been for his failed drug test, which led to his belt being stripped. Following this incident, he continued to fight in many top organisations, including Pride and Strikeforce. There he managed to get victories against the likes of Minotauro and Mark Hunt. He eventually returned to UFC in 2013 and he went a respectable 3 wins, 2 losses. What separates Josh Barnett from the previously mentioned heavyweights is the fact that he consistently fought top opposition for most of his 20-year career. Although it is easy to taint his career by labelling him a drug cheat, the reality is that the majority of fighters in the early days of MMA were on PEDs, and Barnett was just one of the ones that was unfortunate enough or stupid enough to get caught. Depends which way you look at it. Next, and perhaps my most controversial so far, is Tito Ortiz, a former record holder with the most light heavyweight championship defences of any fighter, and involved in one of the most infamous MMA rivalries of all time with Ken Shamrock. Ortiz is no doubt a UFC legend, and if this list was on popularity alone, he would be far higher up this list, but it's on his ability as a fighter. He really struggled to compete with the best once UFC started to become the #1 MMA organisation in the world after prior to closure, and he did lose Frank Shamrock the fight before the start of his title reign. This makes me doubt that if Ortiz fought in Pride in the early 2000s, he would have had the same success he had in the UFC. People will point to his win over Wanderlei Silva, and I think that is a fair point, but I can't justify putting him above other fighters on this list just because his fighting style was quite limited, and like I said, he did struggle against the big names later in his career. The third person in this tier is Vitor Belfort, known for his incredible hand speed, highlight knockouts, and maybe not as favourable TRT use. Throughout his whole career, Belfort has always fought top-level opposition. He had 3 stints at the UFC. The highlight of his first was the stunning 44-second KO win against Wanderlei Silva. In the second, he won the light heavyweight belt after his glove caused Randy Couture's eye to bleed, but it was his third run that he really made a name for himself and knocked out several of the UFC's best. He never managed to reclaim UFC gold, but at times he was seemingly unstoppable. Despite this, Belfort did get knocked out a few times himself, and similarly to others on this list, it is not in question that he did use PEDs. Along with this, his actual title win was not an emphatic one. Therefore, I think good but not exceptional tier is about right for Belfort. On to the next one, we have Frank Mir, one of the best submission grapplers to ever fight over 205 pounds. He is probably most famous for ruining Brock Lesnar's UFC debut, but he has also had first round finishes over the likes of Minotauro, Czech Congo and Tim Sylvia. His heavyweight reign was cut short due to a motorbike accident, and then since then he kept falling at the last hurdle to reclaim the undisputed belt. These losses have stopped him getting any higher in this list, but it is undoubtable that Mir was one of the most well-rounded heavyweights in the division at his peak. Next, we have the fan favourite Forrest Griffin. Exploding onto the scene after his famous win over Stefan Bonner, Griffin seemed to play the perennial underdog and went on to beat Shogun, Rampage Jackson and Tito Ortiz, one of my favourite fighters ever. I kept trying to think of ways to justify having him higher on this list, but the reality is that Griffin was full of heart, but he lacked the skill of others that are higher on this list than him. That is of course not to say he was not skilled. Everyone on this list is very skilled, but he's just not as good technically as the others above him. Last in this tier is Frank Shamrock. Early in his career, he had a good but unspectacular run at Pancrase. It was in the UFC where he really came out of his brother's shadow. He won the inaugural light heavyweight belt and defended it a total of 4 times, the last of which was his Fight of the Year match against Tito Ortiz. After leaving the UFC, he became the Strikeforce middleweight champion, but he was beat by Chung Lee in his first defence. I'm sure some of you would be surprised how low I have Shamrock in this ranking, but in my opinion, his career outside the UFC was not exceptional. I accept this may be partly to do with his lack of proper weight classes early on in MMA. He's quite a small stature to be fighting at light heavyweight and heavyweight as he did, so maybe I would be ranking him differently if he started his career 5 years later. Okay, so now we're into the excellent bracket. We're getting to those real upper echelon fighters. Suitably, we're starting with one of the OGs of MMA, Dan the Beast Severn. He came into MMA with a world-class wrestling background and quickly showed how effective it can be in mixed martial arts, winning 2 UFC tournaments and beating Ken Shamrock in his second attempt at the Superfight Championship. Admittedly, the latter was not the most exciting spectacle, but it was impressive nonetheless. After the UFC, he went on to fight on the independent circuit and eventually garnered an incredible 101 wins, 19 losses and 7 draws record. He is a true pioneer of MMA and deserves a place in this rank. What stops him getting any higher? The fact that he never developed a good enough stand-up game to consistently compete with the very best. Next is Lyoto Machida. His karate style was unique and had not been seen in the UFC before. A 6-fight win streak earned him a title shot, which he emphatically took advantage of by knocking out Rashad Evans. A loss to Shogun eventually followed, and Machida never quite looked the same since then. He is unquestionably one of the most interesting fighters the UFC has ever seen. The first to truly make karate effective in the UFC makes Machida an icon for many. Whilst his career after his title loss never met the same heights, he still had several highlights, and there's no doubt he deserves his place in this tier. Following on, we have Rashad Evans, an Ultimate Fighter winner who propelled himself to the very top with his knockout win over Chuck Liddell. Liddell is one of several big wins, victories over Rampage Jackson, Tito Ortiz, Forrest Griffin, Dan Henderson and Charles Sonnen are all on Evans' record. Evans' losses later in his career may somewhat taint his record, but they should not distract from the fact that he was one of the very best in the light heavyweight division at his peak. Another fighter in this tier is Fabricio Werdum, a jiu-jitsu specialist who has wins over most of the best the heavyweight division has to offer. His guard is perhaps one of the most dangerous in MMA, and he still fights at a high level today despite his 18-year-long career. His stand-up is what is lacking from his game and led to him losing his heavyweight belt. Despite this, there's no doubt he is an MMA legend, and he will always be remembered as the man who ended Fedor's winning streak. Brock Lesnar is next. Without a doubt the biggest draw on this list, Lesnar came into the UFC with an excellent wrestling game, but only one MMA fight under his belt. Many were sceptical he would be able to compete due to his lack of experience. Doubters were seemingly proved right after Lesnar lost his UFC debut in the first round, but it was after that fight that Lesnar really made a name for himself. After winning his second UFC fight, he fought Randy Couture for the heavyweight belt, and to the shock of many, he managed to win. Not only that, but he also managed to defend the belt twice. Lesnar will always be remembered as one of the most polarising names in MMA history, mainly due to his acceleration up the card over fighters more deserving. One thing no one can deny is that Lesnar took full advantage of that push, and his sheer physicality proved impossible to deal with for even some of the very best heavyweights. Finally in this tier is Rampage Jackson. Not quite the very best, but still excellent in pride. He boasts several wins over big names such as Wanderlei Silva and Lyoto Machida. His win over Chuck Liddell at UFC 71 brought a new era to the light heavyweight division after it had been dominated by Liddell for the past 3 years. Despite this, he never managed to put a significant run together against the best, and that stops him entering the greatest territory. Moving on, we are now up to the nearly the greatest category. These guys might come in some people's list as potential GOATs, but for me they just fall short. Firstly, we have Mark the Hammer Coleman. The godfather of ground and pound, Coleman burst into the scene at UFC 10, where he won his first UFC tournament. This was followed by a second tournament win at UFC 11, and then a win of the inaugural heavyweight championship at the next event. After leaving UFC a couple of years later, he found more success in Pride, where he won their openweight Grand Prix. His accolades alone mean it is hard for me to put him any lower on this list. He was so dominant early in his career, and that justifies his place on this list. Next up we have Shogun, most famous for his exceptional run in Pride, where he knocked out a catalogue of great fighters. After joining the UFC, he won the light heavyweight belt by knocking out Lyoto Machida in brutal fashion. Less consistency did follow, and Shogun fell out of the title picture. Despite this, he's had huge success in two of MMA's biggest organisations. Few fighters have managed to do that, and for that reason he has to be judged alongside the greats. Next on this tier is one of the best strikers the heavyweight division has ever seen, Junior Dos Santos. Following his first title defense against Frank Mir at UFC 146, Dos Santos was on a 9-fight win streak in the UFC, which included knockout wins over Fabricio Werdum, Mirko Cro Cop and Cain Velasquez. He was one of the best pound-for-pound fighters in the world. A dominating loss in the rematch to Velasquez followed, and Dos Santos never quite reached the same heights again. He still remains an exciting fighter to watch, and his time at the top was thrilling. Had he got the best of Velasquez in the rematch, he would no doubt be the GOAT contender category, but he didn't, so he just falls short. Next we have Ken Shamrock, a pioneer of MMA whose outstanding submission game and imposing size gave him prominent spots in both UFC's and WWE's history. One of the very best fighters in the early days, there is definitely a lot to be said about moving him onto the GOAT contender. Where he falls down for me is he never quite did it in the UFC. He did win a super fight bout against Dan Severn, but the subsequent title losses were unconvincing, and he eventually lost it in what many state as one of the worst UFC fights in history. Indisputably an MMA great, but not quite on the level of the fighters I've put above him. The last one on this tier is my favourite fighter of all time, Chuck Liddell. One of the UFC's biggest draws in the early 2000s, Liddell was a prolific knockout artist. His combination of precision and power saw him defend his belt a total of 4 times, all of which were knockouts. The feud he had with Tito Ortiz brought international attention to the sport, and Liddell won both fights in convincing fashion. After losing the belt in 2007, Liddell's career went on a downward spiral. This is largely due to his well-documented partying lifestyle. If Liddell had have stayed focused, I am sure I would have been putting him in the top tier, but his lack of longevity means he doesn't quite make it. We are now in the GOAT contender tier. This is for the very best of the best, and eventually I am going to do a video of all the GOAT contenders that I put throughout these videos in all the different weight classes and work out who is the actual GOAT from all the GOAT contenders. So first on this tier is UFC Hall of Famer Randy Couture. A 5-time UFC champion, at numerous stages during his career it looked like time at the top was over, but he always seemed to find a way back up the ladder. Coming from a wrestling background, this was always the foundation to his fight style. He learned other elements of MMA remarkably quickly, especially when you consider he came to the sport age 35. For me, Couture was the first person I thought of when deciding who should go in the top tier. Some may look at his 19 wins and 11 loss record and dismiss him, but if you watch his career, I would be surprised if there are any arguments for his suitability as a GOAT contender. The second in this tier is Bas Rutten. He amassed an incredible 22 unbeaten streak before struggling with injuries and eventually retiring. Early in Rutten's career, his weakness was his ground game, and high-level grapplers such as Ken Shamrock exploited that. This led to 4 losses. In the later half of his career, it is clear he had worked extremely hard on that side of his game, and as a result, became a much better all-round fighter. This led to him avenging 2 of his 4 losses. Unfortunately, we never got to see the rematch against Ken Shamrock later in his career. I personally believe Rutin would have came out on top. His striking game would be too much for Shamrock, and with Rutin's improved takedown defence, he would keep the fight standing. Of course, this is all speculation, but I think prime Rutin was the best MMA fighter of his era. Next up, and quite predictably, is Jon Jones. Despite all of Jones' out-of-ring troubles, it is undeniable he deserves this place as the potential GOAT. He's beaten nearly all of the best the light heavyweight division has had to offer. More recent fights have been less impressive, so perhaps we are starting to see change of guard, but I can never see a scenario where Jones is not considered one of the very best in his prime. Fourth in the GOAT contender list is Cain Velasquez. At his prime, Velasquez was unstoppable. He dominated almost everyone that stepped in his path. The level of control he had over fighters such as Brock Lesnar and Dos Santos was shocking at the time and hasn't really been matched since. Unfortunately, injuries hampered him later in his career and he never managed to get back to the heavyweight belt after losing it to Werdum. I truly think that at his best, Velasquez could beat anyone, and that is why he's a definite GOAT contender. We are now going to move on to the current heavyweight champion, Stipe Miocic. Coming somewhat under the radar early in his career, Miocic went from strength to strength after winning the title against Werdum. He defended the heavyweight belt a total of 3 times, a UFC record, and recently avenged his loss to Daniel Cormier with a knockout win. It's a shame we will never see Miocic against Velasquez, but the rubber match against Cormier is sure to be fascinating. Regardless of the result of that fight, Miocic holds an unprecedented record and is up there with the very best heavyweights of all time. Speaking of Cormier, he is the last person on this list. Like many wrestlers, he came into MMA relatively late, at 30 years old. Early in his career, he mainly fought in Strikeforce, where he compiled an 11 wins and 0 loss record. He then joined the UFC, where he became a 2-division champion. I'm sure there was times where Cormier worried that his legacy would just be his losses to Jones, but his conquering of the heavyweight division means that it will be remembered for far more than that. He said he will retire soon, and once he does, UFC will lose one of the all-time greats. Fortunately, he's still likely to be heavily involved in MMA, even after he hangs up his gloves. So there you have it, that's my tier list for UFC heavyweight and light heavyweight champions. If you disagree, let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed, leave a like. I will be doing another tier list soon for the middleweight, welterweight and lightweight champions. So if you fancy watching that, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, and I will see you for the next one.